husband and I were in Paris in 1966. We were young doctors and it was very hot. So we went into the Grand Palais and there was an exhibition of African art and its impact on contemporary Western artists. And it changed our lives completely. My husband was a scholar and he read every book and every magazine that he could lay his hands on. I was a much more emotional person. I responded to the art viscerally.
Yo! Hold up! Time out! Time out!
Now that we've established what is not African about African art, let's begin the video, shall we? Any look into what is African about African art must start with rituals rooted in African tribal traditions. These rituals, still honored to this day, provide people with a way to worship the natural world around them and to create unity among people. These cave paintings, for instance, done by the San people of South Africa, were not simply drawings of idle figures for amusement. The paintings had meaning to the lives of the San people, making them something that always need to be recognized as ritual rather than art for art's sake. The creation of this art was derived through trance dances that created an indelible link to the spirit world and the ability to channel a metaphysical life force, or num, to reach an enlightened state, as shown in the following clip that depicts a shaman going into a trance where he becomes one with the spirit world. The work of people like David Lewis Williams substantiated the belief that this art had a meaning beyond the physical representations, giving the art and the people themselves substantiation above Western prejudices. This art from the Asante people of Ghana depicts a female figure with a large forehead and an elongated neck adorned with concentric rings. The depiction is not exaggerated for aesthetic purposes, but to metaphorically relate customs and norms of beauty within the Asante tribe that will bring them closer together as a community. In this, the figure becomes a source of empowerment and a reminder to all Asante people that they can accomplish great things if they are all unified in their ideologies. Contemporary African art that honors these rituals becomes African in its positive representations and how they shape views of people. This painting by Norman Lewis, titled March on Washington, represents the past in a positive light and makes allusions to past ritual traditions. Allusions are made by depictions of people wearing what seem to be ritual masks and the ritualized spear that this figure is holding. By linking the March on Washington in the U.S. with the struggles in Africa, Lewis is reminding people of their African roots, and that these roots always need to be remembered to remind us that the struggle of Africans is our struggle as well. Contemporary artist and cinematographer Arthur Jafa also makes allusions to the power of rituals in his depiction of the power of ritualized prayer. In this powerful video, prayer rises to the point of transcendence, as the prayers embody physical manifestations of creation, similar to how the earth itself was created from a planet of fire. colonization of Africa by European powers and the physical and mental toll left on Africa forced contemporary African artists to use art to help Africans gain a sense of empowerment. Artists like Ginka Shonibare attempted to do this by depicting Western people and important events in history in a way that embraces African people. Shonibare talks about his struggle to define what African art is.
One of my tutors said, "Why aren't you making authentic African art?" I felt that actually what's authentic African art, or what's authentic identity in a global modern world. And so those questions have been with me since, and I've explored those questions in many ways.
For example, those so-called African fabrics he uses. Shonibare actually found them in the Brixton area of London, but they were originally batik patterns from Indonesia, brought by the Dutch to West Africa.
So the fabric really is an expression of the kind of hybrid identity. I'm suggesting that it's African, and it's also Dutch, it's also Indonesian, and that's okay.
His desire to create true African art can be seen in his installation Scramble for Africa, which depicts the 1844 conference in Germany to carve up Africa among European powers. By using African-inspired fabrics on the figures in the installation, Shonibare is giving life to the people that are the topic of the conference, even though they are not there. The gestures of indignation by some of the figures, indicative of the tone of the actual conference, seems insignificant in the face of the actual African lives that become more viable and vibrant. The same kind of art can be seen in the U.S., with the creation of the Afro-Cobra movement in Chicago in 1968. These influential artists reinforce that all African Americans are living in a state of disempowerment, and that something had to be done to change things.
Blacks were invisible. Blacks were portrayed as stereotypes, caricatures, and archetypes. And so the struggle to counteract that destructive force is part of what we engage in.
Anything that causes something to change does have to exert some sort of energy.
We came together willingly to hone a philosophy, to make a difference. It was important to develop the principles and something that we could refer to.
Afro-Cobra using Kool-Aid colors was a part of the group. We came up with that idea in terms of the fact that these are the colors that we saw in our community. Something was taken out of each person's work in order to formulate our philosophy.
In creating their art, they reminded people of the struggles that people of color faced in not only the U.S., but in Africa. This acknowledgement of the African diaspora in the U.S. was very important in giving people hope and strength to fight against racial prejudice. In this piece by Arthur Jafa, the chain tire, which represents the rubber that African people worked to provide to European colonizers, is hanging from a gallows, similar to the one depicted in this picture. This installation is a reminder of the genocide of Africans by white Europeans, as well as the lynching of black people and how we must never be blinded to the past. In reclaiming identity, people have found power in the reinvention of what it means to be African or African American. In this, art becomes a way of taking power back from people who have political or socioeconomic control. Artist Wangechi Mutu talks about depiction of art and why it's important.
And the thing that it took a while to understand is a lot of these films had nothing to do with us. There's there's virtually no representation of us young African urban kids in any of these films. A lot of them were predominantly white actors. A lot of them, if they were people of color or African or black were very different from our experience in our life. So I think as an artist, you start to investigate these very lovely minutiae of culture and go, well, why is this and where am I in this story?
The importance of depiction can be seen in the depictions of fashion by the Sapeurs of the Congo, and using fashion as art in wearing Western brands that depict people who transcend past atrocities of colonialism to develop a sense of pride in themselves. More powerful than this, however, is when Congolese people, like Kalidosa, attempt to develop a fashion ideology rooted in Africa.
À partir d'ici jusqu'à là-bas, le tout, ça m'appartient.
And what do you make here?
Je me retrouve dans ma vie quand je couds comme ça, mais ma spécialité, c'est les habits extravagants, les habits qui n'existent pas au monde. Donc, c'est-à-dire quoi? J'aime bien le gilet, j'aime bien la cravate. J'ai aimé de faire un truc là en fil, quand je le pose, je le noue, ça devient un cravate mélangé gilet avec gilet. C'est-à-dire que j'ai créé même les mots cra-gilet, un nom propre, cra-gilet. Donc ça, c'est un nom propre, c'est pas un nom composé par exemple avec un trait d'union, non.
I mean, my impression coming here was that the Sapeurs only wore high fashion designers from abroad. I didn't know that they actually made their own clothing.
Non plus. C'est-à-dire quoi? Nous avons l'habitude toujours de porter les habits des Occidentaux, mais moi je me suis révolté à ça parce que, mais pourquoi pas ici au Congo, on peut avoir aussi une marque qui peut combattre aussi les habits des Occidentaux, une marque congolaise.
In developing a Congolese brand of their own, designers create an aesthetic that becomes healing, like past rituals, in their power to create a spiritual independence from Western traditions. The art of Hank Willis Thomas is another example of how art can help people claim their identity. In the face of past atrocities where black people were persecuted, Thomas uses his art to bring people together in the face of mental and physical anguish, and to remind us that together we can accomplish more. In this, his art is likened to the Ashanti figure that we saw earlier, in that it gives people hope and a sense of unity within a world where those in power attempt to divide us. In conclusion, the ability of people to create art that counteracts socially constructed racial prejudice becomes an empowering element of a new society where race is no longer an issue. Depiction that is not empowering, that embraces stereotypes, only serves to weaken the resolve of people and subjugate them to positions of inferiority. Empowering depictions change social perspectives and remind people of their African diaspora in the face of continued prejudice, so changes can occur that gives people the equality they deserve. In this, art truly becomes African art, in the embracing of African people, and their desire to be given a voice that finally embraces their humanity.